Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this session today, part of the invited speaker series of a project in the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. This specific project is concerning Hinduism in contemporary society, or the intersection of Hinduism and contemporary society. The organizing committee for this group are Cecilia Bastos, Angela Burt, Alan Herbert, and myself. I'm A. Simpson, Professor for Human Resource Management and Organizational Studies at Brunel University, London. Previous invited speaker series for this project have included a presentation earlier this year on the Shakta Agoris, and we've also had a conference on the topic of the intersection of Hinduism and contemporary society. Today, we are honored to welcome our guest speaker, Jens Augspurger, who is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Religions and Philosophies at SOAS, University of London. He's also a member there of the Center for Yoga Studies. And he researches various intersections of religion, power, politics, with a specific focus on yoga communities. Jens is a survivor, activist, and co-founder of Project Satya, which is an initiative dedicated to combating spiritual abuse, coercive control, and institutional violence within religious groups. And today, Jens will be presenting his research titled "In Yoga, We Are Connected," examining the fabric that makes belonging. And so this is going to be a fascinating presentation of research on spiritual pilgrims to India and the intersection there of different identities. I hope that Jens will also share with us a little bit about Project Satya as well before we conclude today. Maybe I'll ask a question. So Jens will be speaking for between 35 and 40 minutes. And then he'll also take some questions for about 15 minutes. If you have a question as Jens is speaking, don't hold it, just put it into the chat, and then we'll take it from there in terms of selecting some of those questions with the time that's available and maximizing that opportunity. So thank you all very much for being here. We're grateful for your presence. And thank you, Jens, for joining us and sharing your research with us today.
Well, thank you, Ace, for your kind introduction, and to all of you for the opportunity to speak here at the Oxford Centre. I'm feeling quite honored to speak in this particular series because, oops, now I have the first technical glitch here. I need to get my notes up at the same time because it's a very interesting and timely topic, and I'm very happy to be able to present and share my research with you. I reckon that now you can't see my presentation, although I've done everything the same way that I've just done it a minute ago.
Oh yeah, we could see it actually until
okay, but I couldn't see my notes anymore.
Right.
I'm not quite sure why. So now you should be able to see it, right?
Yes, we do.
And now it's gone though.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, we see it. Yeah.
You still see it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. It says here that the screen sharing has been interrupted. Okay, so yes, thank you. My talk today is titled "In Yoga, We're Connected." And I'm intending to examine the fabric that makes belonging in transnational modern yoga communities, and perhaps also in other adjunct transnational contemporary spiritual communities around the world. What I'd like to speak to you about today is some sort of preliminary theorizing of the data that I gathered and my findings, and I hope that this will spark an interesting discussion later at the end of my presentation. The phrase "in yoga we're all connected" has been a quite recurring theme in my research and also in my personal experience of practicing yoga. It initially caught my attention when, for the first time many years ago, my local yoga teacher presented to me and a group of people a framework that emphasized the possibility of belonging to a community of course participants, even after the very specific course had already ended. Even when this course is done, she said, even when you're going home, we're still connected in this very setting. Somehow, perhaps I thought this was meant energetically, or perhaps through karma, or maybe she just wanted to say something nice before letting us go home. I did not inquire further at this point. Much later, though, I encountered the same theme again when I became part of a transnational yoga community, and a yoga teacher used that phrase to me when I bid farewell after a several-week-long training. This was an international group, and I believe today that the phrase had a very specific purpose, which was to create a connection and secure my retainment to the group or this specific yoga provider. In the language of consumerism, which I think plays an important role in the contemporary yoga market, we could possibly say that "we're all connected" was the motto of this organization's loyalty program. The phrase or topic "in yoga we're all connected" sparked my interest once again during the COVID pandemic, when I was conducting research interviews with interlocutors who had traveled to India just before the start of the pandemic. At the time of the interviews, they had, like myself at the time, been locked down or locked in various ways and to various degrees in their own homes. This was during what we may now retrospectively describe as the peak of the COVID pandemic, or at least the peak of the politically imposed restrictions to it. So most of these interviews were conducted in 2020 and 2021, which was in Europe the time of the really heavy and restrictive measures against the pandemic. I started researching more on connection and yoga, and I realized that this topic precisely also appeared very frequently in online blogs or posts that people made about yoga, often describing yoga as a means to foster specifically a sense of belonging and connection, for instance, in life or to others. In this presentation today, I will critically examine the meaning and nature of this connection and also explore the implications of the "all" in the statement "we are all connected." My analysis draws on my ethnographic fieldwork in yoga communities conducted over the past 3 years, particularly, as I said, during the COVID pandemic, but also research that I conducted in South India, in Auroville in 2018. And what is of particular interest to me in all of this is to understand the purpose and the functions of this connection, of which I would like to present 2 primary purposes that came up for me in the analysis. One, that is the purpose to facilitate retention of individuals within a group or within a customer base of a yoga provider, And second, from the perspective of the practitioners themselves, the fostering of a sense of belonging and participation in something greater or perhaps more expansive. For instance, an international community of yogis, without having clarity at this point what that really means. So before delving a bit further into the topic, I'd like to address an important clarification about the term yoga. Throughout my presentation, I will consistently use the term yoga specifically to refer to transnational modern yoga. I make this choice to ensure a better comprehension because transnational modern yoga is rather long and clumsy. But I think it's crucial to acknowledge at this point that when I use the term yoga, I'm specifically referring to this commodified system of yoga that is called transnational modern yoga. Yeah, this very specific form of yoga called transnational modern yoga is defined by Suzanne Newcomb as a family of practices shaped by globalized ideas of biomedicine, physical culture, new thought, esotericism, and psychology, among many other factors. And I think that is a very fitting definition for the rather complex phenomenon that we're speaking about. I think it is particularly essential to recognize that the term transnational modern yoga expresses some sort of distance from the discourse on yoga's supposed origins as an, I quote, ancient and so many thousand-year-old practice originating from India. This is a narrative that's frequently utilized by many providers and practitioners of transnational modern yoga in their discourses and marketing efforts. It is important for me to acknowledge that this discourse is a very important source of the imaginaries on yoga that I am working on, such as the recurring reference to India as the source and origin of India, the representation of India as the yoga bhumi, the so-called birthplace of yoga, or even the personification of India as Mother India or Ma Bharat that has given us yoga. And I think all of these deserve a separate dissection of historical origins and entanglement with political streams such as Hindu nationalism. But all I want to say here at this point is that this is a discourse that goes much more beyond what I'm going to say today, but one that is frequently used by transnational yogis, a group of practitioners that are predominantly white and coming from North America or Europe. So in many cases, they are first-generation practitioners, and they do not have any sort of cultural relationships or ethnic association to India. There is no sort of established traditional association they have to yoga or Hinduism. It is in most cases something that they have picked up during their lives by choice, or what we would call voluntarily. So they're what we refer to as first-generation practitioners. I think that the narrative surrounding transnational modern yoga and the entire discourse on the origins is used and is using historical stories to construct a sense of significance, authority, and authenticity. But as I said, it's important to acknowledge that this widely neglects more recent history of yoga, especially of the past 1 or 2 centuries, a history that encompasses several significant events that have shaped what yoga is today, including the impact of Hindu nationalism, the influence of American fitness and aerobics culture, the rise of gurus and also importance of gurus, and of course, the integration of yoga into wider popular culture. But for now, I'd like to take a look at yoga today and yoga as a widely commodified product. Within the realm of yoga, there are several strains of yoga that have been commodified into yoga styles, yoga lineages, yoga brands, and an unmanageable number of certifications that are available, many of which are protected by copyrights and trademarks. These manifestations of yoga present themselves or market themselves usually as distinct approaches of yoga, while many of these would actually be simply categorized as hatha yoga. Hatha yoga being the today widely recognized and popular form of yoga, which is focused on posture, asana, breathing techniques, pranayama, and techniques for concentration or meditation, and that is, so to say, the categorization that yogic studies would make. But many of the practices themselves, they prefer not to use the term hatha yoga, but actually give priority to their own brand names, be it Shivananda yoga, Kundalini yoga, Iyengar yoga, Ashtanga yoga, Medi yoga, hot yoga, Vinyasa yoga, power yoga, and so on. There is an idea of creating some sort of distinction and something unique about these practices. So what makes it difficult for me and for us to look at this yoga market then is to understand who are the entities that we're actually dealing with, who are the stakeholders of yoga. Are they communities, or are they brands, or perhaps even large enterprises? Speaking about community, one thing that I noted and found particularly interesting is that there is a wide range of yoga organizations that negotiate parts of these practices, and networks of yoga studios and of yoga providers that incorporate the concept of community in their self-presentation and in their own activities. Some of these include numerous major organizations that provide yoga, as well as countless smaller ones. For instance, the International Shivananda Yoga Vedanta Centers welcome graduates of their teacher training courses as new members of the family, offering various ways to maintain connection on this website that you can see here. And the worldwide Jivamukti Yoga Organization regularly hosts tribe gatherings, with recent events taking place in Barcelona and plans for the next gathering to happen in Paris, bringing together Jivamukti trained teachers, practitioners, and all those interested. The 2023 Barcelona gathering was described in a testimonial that's been published on the website as a gathering that will forever be etched in our hearts, an unforgettable tapestry of love, growth, and transformation. So I think you're getting all the idea sort of that's transported about this very particular event and how it's being portrayed or marketed. A click on the 2023 recap, however, of the tribe meeting in Barcelona shows something that is relevant to the entire yoga industry. If we want to watch the recap and the recording, we do need to sign up and pay for Jivamukti's own streaming service, which costs approximately $144 annually, or $18 per month. What we see here, and what's illustrated quite clearly, but really makes a statement about the wider state of yoga is that most prominent yoga brands, some of them disguised as communities, operate as money-making entities, although some may employ quite sophisticated structures to obscure this fact. Beyond that, many organizations are perhaps registered as non-profits or religious entities, but they do still engage in money-making in some form of revenue generation by selling products such as yoga classes, training programs, and all sorts of additional materials. As a consequence, many yoga providers resemble the corporate form, perhaps a consequence of the capitalist market dynamics in which they have to operate and survive. But at the same time, there are valid concerns that arise when we look at how yoga is sold by some of these organizations. For example, I just double-checked this morning, a large yoga studio in London charges £15 for a single yoga class, but this particular studio entirely relies on voluntary teachers who are part of their community and are teaching there for free, so they're not being paid, but they themselves have had to pay significant amounts for a yoga certification with the same organization, roughly between £2,000 and £4,000 to do the 4-week training course and then be able to give their labor for free as yoga teachers. So I think what's illustrated here is that invoking a sense of connection and community can often serve as a quite powerful loyalty strategy for some of these yoga businesses. And by fostering a strong bond among practitioners, the yoga businesses can cultivate and create a somewhat dedicated and committed customer base for their own business. Creating a sense of connection also helps individuals feel that they belong to a larger community, providing them with a shared sense of purpose. Many yoga businesses utilize the language and practices that emphasize unity, interconnectedness, or collective growth, reinforcing the idea that the practitioners are in fact part of something meaningful and transformative. By positioning themselves as more than just a service provider, many of these yoga organizations can also deepen the emotional connection with their customers, which we've seen in many other businesses is a very, very successful marketing strategy. Going beyond offering just yoga classes or products, they also seek to create a space where individuals can form relationships, or at least are being told that they can form relationships, engage in shared experiences, and feel ultimately that sense of belonging. And as I said, I think this community sense fosters a form of loyalty of customers that become more invested in the values and the ethos of what essentially is a yoga business. That's being done through community building activities such as workshops, retreats, or these tribe gatherings, where practitioners can come together and connect with others, with so-called like-minded individuals. But I think it raises a very important question about how stable this connection and how stable this access or belonging to the community actually is. For instance, if someone isn't able to pay anymore for it and thus is losing access to the entire community. Further, I think by leveraging the concept of community, the yoga businesses also tap into a human need for social connection and offer somewhat of an antidote to the feelings of isolation and disconnection that many people already experience in modern society, and even more so during COVID isolation. And I believe that that creates a context in which we also need to speak about ethical concerns, about exactly that, and about feelings of perhaps dependency that are created with that. There's also a problem because many yoga practitioners, despite all these community efforts, do not like to strictly affiliate themselves with particular groups and prefer to navigate more freely across different styles and brands in a more fluid manner. This inclination can, on the one hand, be attributed to factors such as mere availability of diverse options, freedom of customer choice, but also to the practitioner's self-identification as spiritual but not religious. That's a term that has been researched quite well and is coming up in many other spiritual communities as well. The identity of being spiritual but not religious often comes with a sense of personal liberty and a desire for exploration, and has emerged partly also from a desire to unaffiliate with more established forms of religion, where affiliation is, for instance, granted through a ritual such as baptism or through birth, and many people did not have the choice to actually decide themselves whether they wanted to be part of this community or not. The identity of the spiritual but not religious community encompasses individuals who engage, as I said, in a wider exploration of disciplines, traditions, brands, and styles within a much larger realm of alternative spiritualities and practices, including alternative medicine. And that's a phenomenon that has been quite aptly described by Veronique Altglas in her book, From Yoga to Kabbalah, where she explains the religious exoticism that comes with that, and the logics of bricolage, a concept that is meant to explain how people form their own sort of belief system by using and taking whatever seems useful and to their liking. The consumer model of yoga that's prevalent today, in which affiliation with a particular brand or lineage is not required per se, and yoga classes or courses can be accessed on a pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-stretch plan, is also catering to exactly this need. Furthermore, there is a considerable lack of consensus regarding the meaning of the term yoga, which allows more fluid and elusive use of the term. Yoga is therefore often employed as a rather broad umbrella term, despite a widespread lack of understanding of what the specific reference are, including what the particular practices are. I think that the confusion that derives from that is directly linked to the extensive commodification of yoga, which has led to branding efforts that emphasize mainly the origins of yoga and promote discourses surrounding authenticity, primordiality, and meaning. These endeavors then often result in competing claims of originality, further obscuring the entire essence of the practice or the meaning of the word. But in other dimensions of consumer culture happening as well, I think, and that's been clearly shown in the data in my interviews, the brandification of yoga also creates an impression of liberty and choice, much to the liking of many of these yoga practitioners. Here, I think this is illustrating this quite well. There is dozens of these quizzes online or articles on yoga blogs, how to find the right yoga style for me. There's just so many, and people require some help or really want to be taken by the hand to navigate the entire market. So I'd like to come back to what this actually means for the sense of connection and also for the purpose of connection, and speak about this time from the practitioner's perspective. Shortly after I started my research, the global outbreak of the COVID pandemic brought international travel to a halt, and I didn't manage to conduct in-person interviews with travelers in India. I instead had to meet them on a screen and through the Zoom lens like we're meeting today. The majority of the interviews that I conducted took place during a period when numerous countries had closed their borders to non-commercial travel and tourism, including India, and flights were often entirely suspended. So there was actually no way to leave the country. And in the case of India, there was actually no way to get into the country. Most significantly, though, many of my interlocutors, including myself at the time of the interview, were confined to their homes. The restrictions imposed by their countries and governments limited my interlocutors' abilities to meet friends and family, or even to take a leisurely walk in a local park. As a result, the pandemic and the ensuing limitations made travel, and especially international travel to India, appear entirely unattainable. And I mean, they were actually also quite practically unattainable, but I would argue that being confined to a home has put these things into a much different perspective, especially when, for many of my interlocutors, even traveling to another city or perhaps taking a stroll in their own neighborhood was either prohibited or at some point also considered potentially dangerous. That was specifically at the time when we didn't know very much about COVID yet, and there was a fear amongst some people that maybe leaving the house itself was already a dangerous activity. Where I was at that time in Germany, there was a curfew, for instance, that started every evening at 8 p.m. So unless you had a dog or pretended to have a dog, you weren't allowed to leave your house. As a consequence, the people I spoke to, they weren't in India at that time, but they had traveled to India just shortly before the pandemic. And a significant number of the people I interviewed had cut their trips short prematurely sometime around March 2020. In response to the limitations imposed, many of them found alternative means to maintain connections to either India or yoga, or to nourish, as they said, their spiritual selves. For instance, through engaging in various forms of online satsang, spiritual gatherings, participating in online yoga, connecting with former teachers, and building a hybrid spiritual life. Once again, a recurring theme was their strong belief that in yoga, we are all connected. Now, when I heard it this time, the phrase made me think much more of the work of Benedict Anderson, who, in a very different context, exploring nationalism, introduced the term imagined community. Anderson demonstrated how the politics of imagination can create a sense of belonging and even unity without personal knowledge of other community members. We don't need to know or meet the others that are part of our community, but we can still foster a tangible sense of collective identity, even in something as abstract as the nation, which isn't always self-explanatory. Interestingly, there's research about a similar phenomenon in much different contexts, one of which, for instance, is linear television, where individuals who are watching linear television, so that means the TV that's following a specific program and that you can follow from your TV guide, can create a sense of connection to exactly such an imagined community of the other viewers that you as a viewer would imagine to be viewing the same thing at the same time, something that doesn't happen in the same way when people are using Netflix or other on-demand streaming services. In any case, the topic of connection in yoga seemed to be a recurring one, and many yoga providers and articles that I found online promised to explain why. Here is just 3 of them that I found. Yoga can help us feel connected to life. One article promises to tell us how yoga teaches us that everything is connected, and another one wants to help us to increase the feeling of connection through yoga. But analyzing all of this, there are 2 significant challenges when we consider the concept of belonging, especially in regards to the continuum of the practitioners who are in that sort of spiritual but not religious continuum. First, that is the interrogation of the notion of belonging in this context is inherently complex. As I've previously stated, many spiritual practitioners entirely reject the idea of affiliation that's commonly found in more established religious communities, and they often do not follow a single organized practice, but engage in these more fluid practices through bricolage or religious eclecticism, blending various beliefs and practices. At the same time, community and belonging do remain central categories in their lives. So I think what happened at that point is I had to find different concept that was trying to explain why community and belonging are important, but how they are important if more traditional or more established forms of community and belonging were rejected at the same time. So what I found is that in the context of modern yoga, belonging is often associated with an adherence to a set of principles and practices rather to a specific community, a gathering, a place that you'd be going to, or a lineage, for instance. These principles and practices are transported through the guidance of a specific teacher, or even online courses, videos, or things that people read, and they are connected to a particular lifestyle that my interlocutors were adhering to. The phrase "in yoga we're connected" draws also from a popular translation of yoga as unity, suggesting that the physical proximity is not necessarily a prerequisite for spiritual fellowship or satsanga. And as access to membership and belonging in many yoga communities is also transactional, involving payment for subscriptions, trainings, and classes, the COVID pandemic has posed additional challenges onto that. I therefore propose an alternative understanding of connection and belonging felt by many of these practitioners that's mediated through the adherence to a rather elusive concept of living a yogic lifestyle. The term yogic refers to something that is related to yoga or characteristic of yoga, and is basically an adjective derived from yoga used to describe practices, principles, teachings, or lifestyles. And it's a word that is very significantly used in yoga communities. I think it's a rather new development, but this has been used as an attribute for many things, and has come up quite a lot in my research. But I'd say it's also worth noting the great ambiguity of the term yogic, because it doesn't really explain itself what it means. From a yoga studies perspective, I'm also quite alarmed to introduce new terms because we already struggle to just define the term yoga. Now, if we're using an adjective, we're just making everything more elusive and more complicated. But I saw that exactly this elusiveness is also what speaks to the flexibility that many practitioners enjoy in being part of something without having to adhere to more traditional forms of community. Second, it's essential to examine whether community and belonging are precise and conceptual translations of the central idea of connection. Does the field really suggest that connection and belonging are synonymous? And who are actually the people that are connected in all this? Particularly considering the context in which this took place, I'd also like to take note of the fact that there is another meaning in the word belonging, which is basically the longing. Not surprisingly, a longing that has been quite pronounced during times when human connection and togetherness were quite severely restricted during the pandemic. Usually we'd say that belonging arises from various sources such as kinship, shared identity, common history, or a shared practice and identity. But in this case, it is also a self-declared form of belonging. There is no formal institution that grants the belonging, and adherence to a yogic lifestyles is perhaps based on belief and self-evaluation eventually. Considering the ongoing debate about whether yoga should or could be considered religious or a spiritual entity, I also attach significant importance to the emic attribute of being yogic. And yes, thanks for the heads up with the time. I'm almost at the end. This attribute gives the rise to the notion of living a yogic lifestyle, which encompasses a broad way a broad way of different dimensions. One is personal choice in behavior. It also involves eclectic elements and serves as a social identity associated with values and priorities rather than innate characteristics. Living a yogic lifestyle ultimately is something that can happen quite gradually. It doesn't involve dogmatic rules and life decisions, but it can be applied and unapplied in various contexts and to various liking. I'm thinking, for instance, the strict advice in some yoga communities regarding diet, the use of intoxicants such as caffeine or alcohol, which is often considered tamasic and therefore not yogic. But in a more flexible reading of this, people would be able to maybe engage in alcohol consumption and then reframe that this wasn't a very yogic day or a very yogic behavior, but the next day could be more yogic. The notion of a yogic lifestyle therefore carries also an aspirational aspect of attempting to create a more yogic existence or gradually transforming various aspects of one's life into something yogic, such as nutrition, relationships, work, mental states, travel, and so on. And I'd also just like to take note that lifestyle is a relatively recent phenomenon and term that actually originates from consumer culture, and it's something that's quite heavily used in commercials. Now, to conclude, the phrase in yoga, we're all connected, prompts important inquiries about inclusivity and the term scope within yoga communities. Defining the all in we are all connected becomes elusive due to the complex dynamics involved. Privilege also shapes the yogic lifestyle, predominantly attracting a privileged segment of practitioners from North America and Europe. This privilege enables individuals to explore specialized trainings, retreats, and products associated with the yogic lifestyle. But the exclusivity raises concerns about who is all included, and of course, concerns about representation within the broader yoga community. The consumer culture surrounding yoga further complicates the concept of connection. The focus on consumerism and branding fosters a rather individualistic approach where connection may become superficial and entirely transactional. In this consumer culture, connection can also be manipulated as a marketing tool rather than a genuine expression of shared values and community. The desire to belong and feel connected may be exploited to promote yogic products, services, and lifestyle choices. This commercialization creates rather exclusionary environments under the disguise of yoga's supposed unity. Eventually, the use of the term yogic requires careful consideration as it reflects a broad category encompassing all sorts of yoga-inflected practices and values, but lacks precise definition. The exploration of connection, belonging, and community in the realm of transnational modern yoga reveals some of these intricate dynamics that are also shaped by historical narratives, the commodification, and some of the individual experiences and choices of practitioners made in light of current zeitgeist and in light of events such as the COVID pandemic. And with that, I hope that I showed some of the main themes that I'd like to transport and discuss with you. And I'm not giving some sort of a definite conclusion here, but instead I'd be happy to discuss with you what your thoughts are on this, and if you think that I'm entirely wrong, or if there is something about it. So thank you so much for your attention and for coming here.